Alex Shepard, reporter at the New Republic in New York, joins me now. That is particularly big news for Australia, having a Kennedy on board.
Yeah, and Caroline Kennedy too. She's been, a political star for quite some time. Has not held elected office, but has been involved in politics for quite a while. She was, I believe, the U.S. ambassador to Japan under Barack Obama. She was an early supporter, along with her uncle Ted Kennedy, of Barack Obama, and has quite a bit of diplomatic experience as well.
Alex, moving on to the elephant in the room, COVID-19, and they're calling it a pandemic of the unvaccinated in the United States.
What we're seeing now are a very clear disparity in case rates in places based on their vaccination rates. I think I was on 2 weeks ago. We were seeing the very beginning of this Delta surge, and I think it's undoubtedly true that that cases are much higher in states with lower vaccination rates and in regions with lower vaccination rates in particular. That's not to say that we're not seeing cases in areas with higher vaccination rates. The positivity rate in New York, where I live, for instance, has been creeping upwards somewhere over 2% now for the first time in quite a while. But it's worth underlining that the cases among the vaccinated are much milder. They're much more unlikely to result in hospitalization or death. And I think that there's a real concern now. You're starting to see a much stronger push from Republicans and conservatives than you were to get people vaccinated during the first part of the year. I think people are really starting to get concerned about what the Delta variant is doing as it's ripping through the country.
Well, New York was very much the epicenter for a long time of COVID-19. Just looking at where you live, you mentioned the high vaccination rates. What is the level of hospitalisation and death in New York at the moment related to COVID?
It's been going, in terms of hospitalization, it's creeping slightly upward. Mostly it's the positivity rate that's going up, though. So you're seeing, a higher number of cases just because the Delta variant is so widespread. But what that exactly means, I think, public health officials that I'm talking to, other people, are still trying to exactly figure that out, because folks who've been vaccinated, it might just be a few COVID particles that are causing the positive test, for instance, and you're not seeing that same kind of hospitalization, and certainly not the same kind of jump in deaths that you saw before, in part because New York City in particular has such a high vaccination rate, in part because so many of us saw the death and trauma that surrounded the city last spring. In other parts of the country, however, it's like the pandemic, is back to an earlier stage because the vaccination rates are so low. In many of these parts of the country, they're somewhere around 30-40%. And there is this very active push, both in using kind of lotteries, but also using Republican figures and other kind of right-leaning talking heads to encourage people to get vaccinated, because I think the concern about the Delta variant is much higher in the country than it was even just a couple of weeks ago.
And there's a large focus on some of those states with big regional rural areas, isn't there?
Yeah, particularly the American South. There's unfortunately a very strong red-blue divide on vaccination, just as there is in almost everything else in the country right now. And I think that's just putting more impetus on Republicans. You're seeing more Republican figures. I think it was notable that Sean Hannity, the Fox News host, devoted part of his program to encouraging his viewers to get vaccinated, because we weren't seeing as much of that earlier on. I think certainly some people like Florida Governor Ron DeSantis were encouraging vaccination, but it got politicized early, and now I think there's an effort to reverse some of that politicization, because the Delta variant is no joke, and it's even in areas with reasonably high vaccination rates is surging.
Yeah, well, we're seeing it here in Australia that the rates aren't particularly explosive, but the vaccination rates are that low that most of Australia can't do much about it. So we're in a little bit of a quandary at the minute. Now, I did read a compelling piece during the week from a doctor from the United States who's working at the coalface of all of this. And basically, she put it very clearly. She said, the last request from many people before I ventilate them is, can you vaccinate me? And her words to those individuals, sadly, is, no, it's too late.
Yeah, and it's chilling for me as well, because that recalls the early days of the pandemic for me as well, when you were hearing from people on the front lines who were talking about people who regretted not taking social distance measures seriously, not taking mask mandates seriously, and then ended up being, gravely ill and in some cases dying. I think, a year plus into this, I think that there are people who still aren't taking this seriously. I think we're also at the moment currently having a kind of mini controversy about athletes, particularly in the NFL, refusing to get vaccinated. And, it's just really imperative, especially in the United States, where getting a vaccine is relatively easy, that we have people do it, because otherwise I think, there are, particularly in blue states, but, there are real concerns that some of the social distancing measures that we adopted earlier in the pandemic may have to come back. And I think for both personal and political reasons, a lot of people, don't want to go there.
Yeah, social media, look, there's so many messages and misinformation and rubbish and kooky stuff that's being spread. Now, let's move away from that infrastructure bill. Is it actually going to get across the line next week?
Next week, I think, is still going to be awfully hard. I think it's difficult because it's a classic Washington, D.C. situation in which this is all happening behind closed doors, and a few people are really sure exactly where this bill is at the moment. Chuck Schumer's very sort of Mitch McConnell-like gambit to push this bill forward earlier this week is unexpected, but also does seem to have had its intended effect, which is to light a fire under senators from both parties to get something done. How close they are, it depends on who you talk to at the moment. I think there's a lot of griping that's happening at the moment. I think the two parties got together again. They've been negotiating off and on over this bill for months now, frankly. And I think this is really the kind of last chance for this smaller physical infrastructure bill to get across the line. Now, if that bill doesn't pass, Democrats, they seem intent on moving forward with what's currently a $3.5 trillion spending package, and they would move this physical infrastructure bill or parts of that physical infrastructure bill into that package. But that could be a tough ask. The Democrats have a very, very slim majority in both houses of Congress. It's only 50 senators and a very small razor-thin margin in the House. So moderates in particular, particularly people who are worried about backlash to big spending, might balk on a bill of that size. So we'll see. I think there's more optimism on this bipartisan bill than there was a week ago. But we've also been told again and again that this bill is close to the finish line. And at the moment, we still don't really have a good sense of what it looks like.
The Capitol riot investigation, what's the latest there?
It's more partisan bickering as usual. Kevin McCarthy's decision to appoint, in particular, two Republicans who've been actively sowing misinformation about the January 6th riot and about the 2020 election itself, it led Nancy Pelosi to say that they were not welcome on the committee. That in turn led McCarthy to pull all of his Republican appointments. That's not to say that this committee won't be bipartisan. Liz Cheney, who was recently booted from her role as the third in command in the House Republican Conference, she'll be on the committee. I'm hearing that there will be one, maybe two other Republicans of a kind of anti-Trump variety who might be involved in some way. This, in a lot of ways, is what we've been talking about with these kinds of issues, where there's been pressure on Pelosi to include Republicans who have doubts about the validity of the 2020 election. But the worry there is that they would use their position to not only spread that kind of misinformation, but also to make the committee's work much harder. So now you have a situation in which, yes, the committee may not look credible to Republicans, but it probably wasn't going to in the first place. They are very committed to making this a serious investigation. It just won't be a serious investigation that has bipartisan credibility.
Finally, changing the subject, what's the general feeling of the billionaires flying into space, Jeff Bezos, and we had Richard Branson on the program here just a few weeks ago?
It's very interesting, I think, because maybe 10 or more years ago, I think there would be a lot of excitement about this kind of full stop. And there is still a fair amount of excitement in talking to people, particularly people involved in the sciences. I think they see the potential of some of this work and do think it's very important. At the same time, particularly given the inequities that COVID has shown, I think there's been a lot of criticism, a lot more than you would see normally. That has to do in part because many of these people have been involved in various schemes to keep their tax bills extraordinarily low, that the benefits to the public are not necessarily immediately clear. So what you're seeing, is in some ways a kind of microcosm of the kind of class politics that have been bubbling up. I think starting in the financial crisis, you saw them in Bernie Sanders' campaign in 2016. And now I think instead of what you might have expected, a kind of celebration of space travel a la the late 1960s, a lot of what you're getting is it's not necessarily joy or scorn so much as just kind of eye rolling.
Well, being a fellow sports fan, I know you are. I'm not. You noticed I did not bring up the fact that the Boomers beat the US because we haven't got to the big dance yet. But I know that for the next couple of weeks, people like you and I will be glued on the action out of Tokyo.
Yeah, it's wonderful to see. I think it's still going to be strange without spectators there, but I'm certainly very grateful, particularly since the NBA Finals here ended this week. It's nice to immediately be able to go and watch something else. I think the hope is just that everyone stays healthy and safe during the competition. But I'm very, very excited to spend the next few weeks watching the Olympics.